Good morning and welcome to Relationship Wednesday with Coach Ellis. Today's the day I spend just a few minutes speaking to people about relationships, particularly women over the age of 30 who are in, want to be in, or have been in relationships with men and want to have better relationships. So we talk about the things I call relationships universal lessons or the rules. Today I want to spend just a few minutes talking to you about how to keep your head when he loses his mind. How to keep your head when he loses his mind. And what this really comes to is this idea that sometimes the man in your life is going to have some very serious issues. Now, it doesn't matter whether or not it's an addiction issue, alcohol, drugs, other women, whether he spends too much money, whether he's disrespectful. Lady D, it doesn't matter what his issue is. The truth of the matter, we all have some issues. So how do you keep your head when he has lost his mind? Nothing is harder. The only thing harder than being a person in trouble is loving that person who's in trouble. The only thing harder than being an addict is being in love with someone who is an addict. The only thing harder than being somebody who can't control their impulses and urges is being married or being in love with that person who cannot control their impulses and urges. So how do you keep your head when he's losing his mind? So I got a couple of tips for you. And I want to be careful. I want to be honest with you. While it may seem simple, it is not easy. Because ultimately you must decide before you engage in any activities whether you are in this to win this. Because if you're in it for the long haul, then it doesn't matter what he does except if it puts you in physical risk. If he's beating on you, just get some space. Okay? But if you're in it to win it, if you're in it for the long haul, if you're in it until death do you part, if you're in it until you can't take it no more, if you're in it and you're committed to it, then you're going to approach his psychosis, his issues, his problems differently than if you're in the relationship to make yourself feel good. They just pass the time. If he's Mr. Right now, not Mr. Right. And if he's Mr. Right for you and he has issues, I'll offer just a couple of recommendations on how to keep your head when he's lost his mind. First of all, remember who he is, not who he shows you. Remember who the guy you fell in love with, not the guy that's presenting himself. And some people say, well, it's the same guy. It just over time came out. But the truth of the matter is that at our core, we are the same. And whatever happens to trigger us doesn't change who we are at the core. So if you fell in love with this kind, caring man, and now he's narcissistic and selfish and verbally abusive, remember who he is, not who he is showing you. It doesn't mean you got to take all this garbage off of him. Just remember and set in your mind that you remember who he is. I remember that, some of you have heard me tell the story that when I was in college, I was dating this young lady, and I kept my car in an absolute mess, an absolute wreck. I basically lived out of my car, so there was stuff everywhere. And I said to her one day, well, I'm just junky. And she says, no, you're acting as if you are. But at your core, you're organized and you're structured, but you're acting as if you're not. This is the type of mindset you have to apply if you're in this to win it. He is showing you one thing, but at his core is something else. Second thing, once you remember who he is, speak to who he is, not what he does. You are the man that God has called you to be. You are the guy I've chosen to give my life to. You are the guy whose heart is safe in my hands. Remind him, speak to who he is, not to who he is showing. But again, this is simple. This is simple, but not easy. And the idea is, as you're speaking to the core of who he is, whether he has outward appearances or not, His spirit, his soul is hearing you call the greatness out of him. So call it out of him by reminding him who he is. The reason this is important, and a lot of women don't get this about their man, is that your voice and what you say to him matters. And if you're calling out his greatness if you're calling his greatness out of him, as resistant as he will be, he will hear it because your voice penetrates all of the darkness. It is a flashlight in the midst of darkness, cutting a path to his personal greatness. So remember who he is. Speak to that greatness and speak to who he is, not what he shows you. The third thing is, and just very briefly, is after you remember who he is and you speak to who he is, act in a way consistent with who he is. If he yells at you, don't respond to that. Respond when he speaks to you in a manner of which you know that is indicative of who he truly is. When you speak to him, don't return anger for anger. Speak to him in a manner as if you're speaking and calling out of him. Respond to him, to who he is, and not react to what he does. The reason this is important, again, many women don't get, if he has an addiction issue, he has to be reminded constantly of what's in him, not what he's showing. Because we as men will get caught because we tend to measure ourselves by what we do. And the truth of the matter is we are not what we do, but we have learned to do that, to measure ourselves by what we do. So when we act out of character, we begin to assign character flaws and we begin to assign negative traits to who we are. And that's not true. That's not the truth. It may be factual, that's how we're acting, but it's not the truth of who we are. And we must have somebody to help anchor us. The reason you are stuck with that guy who you fell in love with but now acts like a parquet, the reason you're with that guy who was a wonderful father and now, because of his addiction issues, you can't depend on him to go across the street. The reason you're in love with that guy is that Providence has said, girl, I trust you with him. With all of his jacked upness, with all of his potential, with all of his issues and his problems, in every circumstance, situation, and condition of his life, I trust you. When you ask, why me? Because Providence trusts you with him, and he cannot be who he needs to be if you're not calling it out of him. Behind every great man is a great woman. We've heard that, but here's where that greatness comes at. Despite how he acts, you call out of him what you know is in him. Because let me tell you something. If you've been with him more than a day, you've invested into his greatness, not into his psychosis. So get the return on your investment. Hey, if you got questions or comments, hit me up in the comment section below, or catch me at coach@therulz.com. That's TheRulz.com. Or hit me up on my Facebook page at Coach Ellis. Until next week, have a one-tabulous, wonderful relationship and calling the greatness from him Wednesday. God bless you. We'll see you next week.